I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we welcome one of the most sober, grounded, and articulate science communicators in the field today. A science communicator bringing great hope, courage, and above all, access to the mystery. Help me welcome Susanne Moser. There are all kinds of things I could ask to speak with you about, and what I'd actually like to do is be attentive to your space, to your heart, and part of, I imagine, just about every conversation you have around this stuff has got stress built into it. It's just the nature of the beast, and so what I'd like to just ask you about, maybe this is the next layer of check-in conversation, is how is your heart? Meaning, how much space do you have for some of the tougher sides of this conversation? Because I could go in a way that's very similar to this gorgeous interview that you did. I don't know, it's not dated, the one that I pulled up and have been really reading and enjoying. I think it was in, they end up calling it How to Cope and Even Hope in an Age of Apparent Doom. And, that seemed like, sure, there was some edgy pieces of that, and I think you were as clear as you ever are. And I could stay, pretty close to that track, if that seems about right.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have any predetermined constraints around where our conversation goes. So, and I'm willing to go all kinds of places with with this topic. I was just literally, before we spoke, on the phone with a journalist, who wanted to know about coastal retreat, and we ended up only talking a lot about the psychosocial needs around that. So I'm well oiled, shall we say.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because given that it seems like from very different directions, we end up spending a lot of time covering similar ground one way or another.
Yeah.
I just wanted to check in with you about that, because I know for me, I have really spacious, good days, and then I have days in which I'm contracted and don't have nearly the capacity. So just trying to honor
we'll
that.
find out. We'll find out with each other how far we can go. But it's, yeah, I mean, it is a very demanding topic, and I feel like in this day and age, with my own personal life and what's going on in the world, it demands that we practice that muscle. And I think it's also okay to contract, right?
Oh, absolutely. You bet.
Yeah. So shoot away, go away.
Right. Well, all right, I'll just do a semi-official startup here. And what I'd like to ask is that you would fill in the particulars that are important for you to be known, that you would like to be known as, current titles, or topics that you cover more often than not in your consulting work, or what's new for you. So I would appreciate if you would do that part of it.
Yeah, sure. And maybe, you know, not just stick to the more official titles and all that. I mean, I do run my own independent research and consulting firm, and I have affiliations here at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and Antioch University, New England. But really the way maybe I would introduce myself is as a boundary worker, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
as a boundary worker between the world of research, the world of science, and the world of practice, the boundary between, so many different disciplines. I have a home in geography that always seemed to be a broad enough playground
Mm-hmm.
to get, you know, study the earth and all its many creatures on it. But that's really been sort of the broadest playing field from which I can go in any direction with my work. And
Yeah.
I have, you know, whether I dabble into the study of how science interacts with society, whether it's policy and the world of practice, you know, very pragmatic kinds of questions around coastal management or
Sure.
environmental protection, natural resource, urban planning. I mean, those types of things. And more recently, well, at least for the last 10, 15 years, this intersection between psychology and climate.
Mhm.
At first, I was really interested in that from a communications point of view, like how do we communicate it without ignoring the emotional responses people have to this topic. And that's still of great interest to me, but the psychological responses to climate change are here and present and big in any conversation. And so I've gotten very interested in sort of how do we process what is going on with our earthly home, and how do we decide to be with that, with our emotions, with each other, being in emotion around that. So I feel like I'm living in that boundary space between all these different topics and themes and worlds. It seems like I'm most comfortable there as opposed to being not neatly put into any one of those boxes.
Yeah. Susanne Moser, Susie Moser, thank you so much for that introduction of yourself. I am now freed from the to offer anything close to that. And welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. As I already mentioned to you in your participation in a recent, very brief webinar that Becca Young Allen, used to be Becca Martinson, and I put on last month. And we're, of course, now in May of 2020. And I mentioned to you in that when we got to speak briefly in that webinar that you have just been a remarkable guiding star in terms of science communication in a time when I went from not having a clue what science communication was to now I'm at least minimally conversant as a layperson. And given the rather somber place that I've landed as I've put together my own framing of where we are and where apparently we're headed as a global culture, I've just so appreciated your take on hope. Hope has been one of the most dicey and so often ill-conceived, what would be the badly used, badly put into operation in our culture. So there are a few things that I'd love to do, starting with hope, and just to plant a seed for where I'd love to go a little later on, given the pieces you just laid out for us that you're very comfortable speaking about. Maybe I could start with an earlier written interview with you that I've been really enjoying. uh, going through, and you fairly early on in that interview offer a place to start as a definition of hope. You're quite careful to not say there's one. There are many,
Right.
and but you gave the person you were being interviewed by a place to start in the conversation. So perhaps we could start there also, and then where I'd like to go from here is toward the conversation of our collective agency. So we'll see if we get there. That's just my fantasy of where we might go. And
Yep.
let me just give you the piece that I'm particularly fond of. I think it's great that you actually started with a brief touch into one of Para Espen Stoknes's terms about Pollyanna hope, because it's so darn common. The
Right.
notion that things are going to turn out well tomorrow, just by declaration and wishful thinking, and you go on to say how completely useless that has been and especially is now. So I couldn't agree more. So let's go to the one that you were a little more sincere about. We're really illiterate about what it means to be a hopeful person in society and in our lives. It does require really looking at the truth of what is. And in our case now, looking at the truth of the science of what could be. And then the ability to be with a constant sense of uncertainty. If I'm convinced the future is going to be great, I don't need hope. If I'm convinced that the future is completely trashed and doomed, I don't need hope either. Hope lives in a space of uncertainty, of not exactly knowing what might come, but orienting ourselves towards something at least good, if not better, and applying ourselves to the best future that can be. So, thank you for that. I think it's as good a starting place as any, giving us a few solid foundation pieces. The piece that I want to offer as that first step toward a conversation about agency is what you mentioned about it does require really looking at the truth of what is. And in our case now, looking at the truth of the science of what could be. And truthfully, I could spend the whole time in this conversation just talking about that, because I'm more stopped in this conversation. I'm more stymied in this conversation than I was 8 years ago when I really started my deep dive into this whole body of work. I think at literally every level I'm able to perceive, especially the more obvious and more culturally, societally important, the further from truth we collectively appear to be. In my experience, we're further from a collective experience of truth than at any time in my lifetime, and I'm bold enough to say in human history, but I'm way out of my league to have that kind of projection. If I just look at what an amplifier, I don't really consider the coronavirus to be even a bounce in the needle of the issues that I believe you're talking about in all of your work, and certainly what I address from a very different place in my work, which is a stack of existential level concerns. Climate change being one of them, gets a lot of airtime, but even that is not the most urgent from, again, my point of view. But it doesn't matter which one we put on the stack. The stack is just this white hot, incredible bunch of concerns. Can you speak to what your experience is about our capacity for telling the truth to ourselves, our capacity to see the truth and to tell the truth, and how that fits into your current kind of daily usable definition of hope? I'm so curious because I've changed so much just in the past 3 months, and it's not a good change. And I'm just so curious. Do you feel a similar kind of change and catalysts, wanting to shift things inside of you in a significant way, or not so much?
Well, let me maybe start this with a personal answer. I would say for myself, over the last 20, possibly even 30 plus years, I have sort of grown a muscle for truth. It is not something, I started to become aware of climate change as sort of the topic that I'm focused on, and associated global changes, whether it's biodiversity loss or other major changes like this, probably in the mid 80s. It came into my house back then through a magazine my mother had subscribed to, environmental organizations, monthly publication. And then I went on to graduate school and, sort of really learned more about it from a scientific point of view. But it sort of came in through that. And my mother would still tell you stories of how I, told her back then all these predictions of what's going to happen, like, completely wildly overestimating my ability to predict, just because, what did I know? What did science know at that time, right? But I was enthusiastic enough as a youngster to think I knew. And, now she would say, well, you were so right. You were absolutely right, whatever. But the point is, that's the level of truth that I knew then, and have gone through, I don't know how many rounds of, deepening into the truth of more of what we know, and taking that in, not just as a cognitive thing, as a truth just in my head, but in a truth that I would take into my body. I, in the early 1990s, discovered the work of Joanna Macy and had the great fortune of learning her, exercises and rituals to take in more of that truth. I've just written about one of those, and I don't know if you've seen this, a book that just came out, Wild Love, that honors Joanna. And I wrote about my first experience of a truth mandala, as she practiced, and that's sitting with the truth. And every time since then, I've been through so many, and I've used so many different modalities and ways of being with the truth, as I understood it. I feel like I've gone deeper, and then I come out, and for a while I feel fine, and then I go down into another deep despair around, I just can't believe we're doing this to this one and only home that we have. So it's not been this, I'm willing to see the truth and nobody else is. It's like my own process of deepening and strengthening my willingness and muscle to be with not only more truth because we know more, we understand more about how the Earth system works, but simply letting that in deeper. So in that way, in that same way, I somehow believe we as a society need to grow our muscle, to be with the unfolding truth. And for some folks, I think they're right there. They've been at the edge of despair and at, in desperate situations for a much longer time than some of us more privileged ones. And for some, it is still something they can keep at arm's length, and they don't need to, quite face that yet. I think that will always be true, that differential within society, just by virtue of our privilege, by virtue of our willingness to face it, and then how we choose to be with that, right? I mean, there are people who face a truth that they see and they're willing to go to the next store and buy arms and more ammunition, and that's not my response, but you could see how whatever they see in their perception of the truth, that, that's one response people have. So to me, that just scares me more, but so we see different parts of truth, we see different depths of it, and the timing is different. So I think that, you can see that now. I mean, here you are in the level and depth of, and the expansiveness of truth that you see and your response to it. And you turn on TV and you're thinking like, whoa, what world are you living in, right? It just doesn't compute. And that is also a facet of our truth. This actual deliberate manufacture of veils to guard and disguise where we are. I think that is in sort of my framework and my conception of when we go into an underworld journey, either individually or collectively, there is that time when those in power will use that power to disguise and to create an alternative reality. And that actually has happened many times in human history, and you see it with every dictator going down. I mean, every dictator has created, look at what we're witnessing right now and what an alternative reality is being created very consciously, very deliberately, to confuse us. And, there've always been on the other side people who refuse to buy into those alternative realities. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just where we are, and it's going to be harder and harder to avoid facing truths that we have created. And so, in many ways, my own work as I see it at this time is to help people in that process, and when they arrive at that moment of being willing to see the truth, to not let them get stuck there, because it is, a very quick and easy place to just drown, to just get paralyzed. Mm-hmm. I don't think the descent that we're going through at this time is the end of the story. It's never been the end of the story, to go down, to lose something, to have to transform, to let go. Absolutely. But then there is, more to that story. And to me, that is where I see these notions of radical hope that we need to create that alternative future and to not get stuck in the descent.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. This might be a good place to explore a couple of other terms that are in the parlance of the relatively small pocket of people that I think really make up your audience and mine obviously being a tiny subset of yours, and unfortunately people who are collapse aware or at least concerned enough about the environment to be able to call up a consultant like you to put you to work in any conceivable way. That's a gorgeous population pocket, but
most people don't want what I'm talking about right now.
Yeah, me either. There are a couple of words that come to mind. It's still sort of in light of eventually talking a bit more about agency. And one word that's a bit more popular these days is adaptation. In these roughly 8 years of deep dive for me into this topic, adaptation has really not been considered in a very good light. It is, from the sort of activist side or the progressivist side, it seemed like it was a number of steps toward business as usual, from true mitigation, from true change, from what we really need to do, says this or that strongly opinioned author or activist, or yeah. And now we've got deep adaptation, which I've been connected with since they started up the forum last year. I've been a volunteer moderator in what's called the Holistic Approaches and Guidance Group. It's the group of folks, most of whom are professional one way or another in terms of being counselors or coaches or workshop facilitators and so on, who are actively collapse aware at some level, at a significant level, and somehow compelled by Jem Bendel's original message to be able to say, yeah, count me in, I want to be engaged in this community somehow or another. And of course, there's the Positive Deep Adaptation Facebook group for people who are inclined toward the social media side of things. I still don't know quite where I stand with the whole idea of adaptation as opposed to mitigation, as opposed to other ways of framing significant change, or here's my fantasy word, transformation. That's really
That's the word. Yeah.
How I grew up in the business of doing personal development training and working with executives and blah, blah, blah. I was in a transformation-based world. And so I'm really, that's that distinction. Now, of course, you can buy a pair of socks that promise transformation. So it's obviously been co-opted out the wazoo. But I guess for a moment, if maybe the best we get now is some sort of adaptation, and okay, let's go deep adaptation. Let's create a safe environment for myself and my fellow concerned citizens of the world to be able to sit in circle and to be able to offer compassion and healing and love. And there's not a bad thing in that list. I mean, this just gorgeous and much needed, especially for the folks who are just having their woke moment and realizing, holy shit, this is really happening. And this is happening at a scale that I never could have imagined. So how important is that, to be able to invite someone into a safe container where they can start to feel some camaraderie, that they're not insane, that they are not alone, which better than I do, is just such a huge part of many people's process in this topic. I'm wondering if anything I'm saying is sparking you about the distinctions ranging from transformation to significant change to mitigation to adaptation. Yeah. And I'm not speaking so much about the seawall that they want to put around Manhattan to the tune of billions of dollars and so on. That's the obvious external version of it. I guess I'm speaking more about the individual and collective inner versions of each of those terms. So I don't know if that helps to just spark you in any way, but if you would just take it and run any way you'd like.
Yeah, so I guess maybe the place I start, and I'll just sort of take off from my scientific training and from the early days of that conversation about mitigation adaptation, and then move us to this more transformative work you're talking about. 20, 30, 40 years ago, we spoke of mitigation in the climate context, and I will emphasize that because mitigation somewhere else means other things. But in the climate context, as dealing with the climate problem, as I like to say, on the front end, at the causal level, looking at, what are the mechanisms that we have, policies and market and otherwise, to reduce emissions. Whereas adaptation in that context was dealing with the back end of the problem. In other words, the impacts and how to plan for them, prepare for them, and reduce them minimize them to the possibility as much as we could. So that was, that's the terminology in which I sort of live most of my days. And, when Jem came out with his paper, it started in many ways to confuse a lot of people, and I think in some ways hide some of the beauty of what he's actually calling for. Of course, the word deep, that's become popular, right? There's deep play, there's deep economy, there's deep ecology, there's deep everything. So now we have deep adaptation. And for some people who are aware of all these other deeps that are out there, it just immediately put them in the out, because they can dismiss that as, being whatever on the fringes of most other disciplines and concerns and whatever. Dismissing in many ways, getting hung up on scientific details of his paper, and then could just basically critique it and not be concerned with it. Of course, what he meant was, being willing to look at the truth of where we are and letting that guide our thinking, our work, and quite frankly, both the work on mitigation and on adaptation and in the rest of our lives, right? How would we want to conduct ourselves knowing what we now know? And so when I first learned about it myself, I was a little concerned that it would end up just being a sort of, hitting people over the head with a collapse message without taking them beyond that. That's sort of what I mentioned earlier about not getting stuck in the descent, or in that collapse awareness. Yep. But it turns out, a lot of what is offered through the Deep Adaptation Forum now, all the different aspects are really about doing the very deep work we as a society must do to let go of the old, to reckon with, how we've been, how we think, how we are with each other, with nature, the rest of it, and creating some alternative to that is life-sustaining and life-supportive. And so I actually, you just said something in your intro to this question about having a safe container. In my mind, I often come to these questions from a Jungian perspective on transformation, and including some maybe more mythological ways of describing what happens in transformation. And the container is not just there for support. The container is to increase the psychic pressure. The container is for there to be deeper, basically to build up the pressure for you to really let things fall apart that must fall apart, and to reckon with the pieces and to discern what of that is worth keeping and what of that do I need to let go, and to sit in that not knowing, that uncertainty we talked about earlier, and see in that cooking pot, what emerges, what new compounds are being created under that kind of heat and pressure. I mean, it's, almost, it's profound to think about, that we are in a heat trapping situation, right? Quite literally how that is beginning to create the very conditions for transformation in any other circumstance. I don't know if you're aware of the work of Carol Berzonsky, a depth psychologist who has written about this. We have written a little bit together on this topic, and the symbolic and very real nature of this transformation involving heat, involving very challenging, disruptive circumstances. So to me, this is an enormous opportunity, and I think a big part of what we must do as those of us who are willing to facilitate or hold those spaces for others to come into these truths and to hold spaces for the reckoning, is to help people see that the grief part, the anxiety part, the fear part that is so common at the early stages of this is not the end of it. There is an arc to transformation where you come back out of that melting pot, out of that pressure cooker, truly changed, truly deeply changed. And so for me, the word transformation is absolutely the right word for this, meaning that you will not be the same. You will be unrecognizably different from who you were before you entered that process of transformation. And I think that is our chance. That is our hope. We can refuse it. People refuse transformation all the time, and it's typically ending in disastrous consequences. So that's our choice. And I think that therein lies an incredible power.
Well, I'm with you. I'm delighted by how much overlap there appears to be in how we hold some aspects of the transformational process. I'm just curious, as a side question here, there are an awful lot of people who like to use the words of the hero's journey and that particular type of dynamic or framing for what I think you and I are talking about in transformation. And while that is sort of a classic in the classic framing for one way that transformation can occur, rite of passage for young people into adulthood, or adulthood into elderhood, and so on. And I'm a bit, my spidey sense, my warning flags go off in those conversations an awful lot. And I'm not trying to say that that's what I was hearing you describe, by the way. This is just a little side pocket that I'm curious what your thoughts are. Because having been around the conversation of that type of rite of passage work, that sort of transition, it needs to be held. In the human history that I've been able to poke around in to find out how has this gone in cultures past, and in the very few that still hold on to some sort of rite of passage transition work. And there are no adults in the room, is what I would assert. And so I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts about that particular framing and this point that I'm?
Yeah. So I'm not averse to that comparison, although I think it could easily be too simplistically done. Just as you're suggesting, there are some significant differences, and there are some stages to the process that might be more complicated or more, slightly different than that. But I think on some large level, in the sort of arc of the human species, or particularly the human society as it currently is, we are acting as pretty pathological adolescents, and are now pushed to either grow up or die in some ways. And that is, in the larger arc of how humans grow up and how they evolve, that is not, that is quite, you know, what would now or should now happen. So we are possibly at a point of that kind of transformation, that kind of rite of passage into a greater level of maturity and adulthood. I would say that. And again, I draw here on the work of Carol Bruzanski, with whom I have had many, many conversations about this topic. So, you know, so I will say that. Are there no elders in the room? There's certainly not enough, and certainly not enough of them who remember what it means to hold a rite of passage, and how to hold people through that. There are some, I would argue, and you know, some that have relatively recently passed, but who are still offering some of their thinking and wisdom. I'm thinking of Thomas Berry. I mean, we still have Joanna Macy. You know, there are a few. There are organizations that support that kind of growing up and growing ourselves some elders, like the Animas Valley Institute and people like Plotkin, and you know, so I think there are a few people available. May not be enough, and so, you know, what's interesting to me though is that even in the absence of this, and this is maybe what I think is the most interesting part, is that, so again, I come from this maybe Jungian perspective of an archetype. An archetype is something that has its own power. And it seems like we're self-organizing right now in the absence of having elders to say, you're right, and you're ready, and you should go to a rite of passage. You know, I mean, we seem to be self-organizing ourselves in a deep adaptation forum, or in whatever flavor is you witness out there, transition movement and whatnot, where people seem to be readying themselves for that process. So I find it quite fascinating to just watch this, that even in the absence of elders, apparently something in us is calling us to grow up.
Right.
So, you know, it's going to be a lot harder to do this without a ritual context, to do it without elders, to do it on our own. You know, typically when that has happened, and when now young people try to go through their own rituals, driving really fast, drinking a lot, eating, you know, smoking, whatever, lots of drugs, those are dangerous times, and they sometimes end up deadly. And I think, you know, this may end up deadly for way too many people than I'm happy with. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Really lovely kind of remapping of some territory, and I just appreciate your realness and the sobriety of your response. Thank you. You know, we actually have sort of ended up in this area that I was hoping we'd get to, which is maybe it's the intersection of agency and truth-telling or truth-seeing. Because I'm noticing that there was just about the time that Extinction Rebellion started up, as soon as they started talking about their core principles, that first one being tell the truth, I just about spontaneously combusted. I was so excited. Like, it didn't really matter what they were wanting to do. I wanted to be a part of it, just to start there. And I still am stunned, having just kept track of, from a couple of layers out, how they've been creating themselves, organizing themselves, taking care of their people, communicating with the outer world. It's really something. Just stand alone, whether or not we have a world on fire that they're actually trying to be effective in. I'm just very, very impressed by what they've created and how they've created it.
That's what I mean by this self-organizing ourselves for change, for
Yeah.
deep transformative change, right? Whether, I mean, it's actually made up of mostly younger people. So, you know, not necessarily elders, but
Yeah.
somehow intuiting their way into a rite of passage. So, good example.
Yeah. Yeah. So this thing about agency, I'm wondering if maybe just by bringing up XR as an exemplar of some of the transformational qualities and so on, or self-organizing qualities, I'm really digging deep these days to find any sort of sense making, to find anywhere to rest in some amount of truth that feels like something other than sand going through my hands. I don't know how to have a more gentle, and this may sound odd for me to use this word, but for me, the coronavirus pause that has been put in place in most places on the planet to slow, and in some rare cases, stopping aspects of this omnicidal human operating system, I think it's the most gentle opportunity for looking and for telling the kind of truth you and I are talking about. That, you know, it was certainly nothing I could have predicted, and I didn't even know to think to want it, you know. But here it is, and do I want death and suffering? No, I don't. That's just a given. I don't. But compared to what I see with or without coronavirus on the very near horizon, and the scale of human suffering and the virtually annihilation of anything, any wild animal, any wild animal biomass larger than any animal larger than my fist, is on schedule to be gone before 2030. And I think that's intensely accelerated in a world in which the economy is shut down because people got to eat. So they're going to go and bushmeat it to death. I'm sharing right now, and I'm not expecting any significant response from you. If you have any, yay. I'm just sharing my this swampy place I am in, for, you know, not constantly, but on a fairly regular basis, at least a couple times a day for a little while. I'll start to ponder, how do we come anywhere near addressing truly telling the truth? And how on earth could something happen that is the scale of transformation you and I have been brushing up against in this conversation? How do we have anything remotely like that without telling the truth about that? So again, I'm just sharing. If you want to just say thank you for sharing and move on, that's okay.
No, I actually, I latched onto something that you said that is for me a very beautiful image and a good place to begin. You held out your hand and talked about, you know, the truth that is like sand holding that in your hand, and not much, not much remains in your hand. And I want to say, yeah, exactly. You don't have the whole truth. You only have the few kernels in your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And someone else has another hand, and another person has another hand. And maybe if we all threw our hands together in one pot, maybe we would come a little closer to what this is. And I don't know, I had recently an experience in my own life where, you know, I held a particular story of something that happened in my life, and I thought that was the truth with a capital T. And turns out it wasn't. I got an opportunity to see that story through another person's eyes. And it turns out I had a few kernels of that truth only.
Mm. Mm.
And it was profoundly transformative and healing to get a bigger piece, and at the same time realizing that even with two pairs of eyes, we're only seeing, you know, a fairly tiny part of what actually happened, and who knows how much bigger that story actually is. And, you know, I mean, it maybe depends on whatever faiths you have in bigger pictures and stuff like that. But the point is, I just, even with the glimpse of one more pair of eyes, I saw a different story than the one I had held for 20 years. So it was very humbling and very healing and very good for me to be reminded that I only have such a small piece of that truth.
Yeah.
And, you know, so every time I recognize myself latching onto a truth, particularly about the future that hasn't been created yet, that's when I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, Susie. You know, I mean, we cannot know whether in 10 years we have completely collapsed. That is a possibility. And we simply don't have the eyes to see that. We simply cannot know that. There are many signs of, you know, and I'm I'm just rooting myself here in whatever limited eyes science has in seeing. I'm rooting myself in those, and it's not looking good, you know, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that really mean for me? It's not that they're going to have it right. I mean, so far, if you look 10 years back and what science knew then, it was so much less than what we know now. And it was so much less harsh what we allowed ourselves to see back then as scientists. You know, now we see additional things, and things are happening faster. And so, you know, it may very well be that we will discover and be in the midst of, you know, far worse things or lesser things, whatever, or they come out of not these big trends that we're all projecting, but they come out of a tiny little virus. You know, I mean, there are so many aspects to this future that we don't know yet, including the good things. I mean, you know, we keep looking at the tipping points in the climate system, in the Earth system, and we have tipping points possibly in our streets. You know, Extinction Rebellion and everybody else and their uncle coming from new angles on this. Social tipping points are just as real. Mm-hmm. We tend to not take those into account in our fears of a very dramatically negative future. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that maybe the only thing that those fears of a collapsed future ought to do is make us make better choices about right now. Right? How do you want to conduct yourself in the face of great uncertainty? Mm-hmm. Been involved for the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years or so in something called a Council on the Uncertain Human Future. If you actually that whole sentence in there, Council on the Uncertain Human Future.org, you get to the website of that particular endeavor. It was 12 women from all walks of life putting our hands of grains of truth together in what we were seeing and being in conversation with each other about, so what does that mean about how we want to live and how we want to conduct ourselves, what to apply ourselves to. And it also began with that truth telling, but, you know, knowing full well that each of us just had that tiny slice on it. And just being in that conversation, it has had so many ripple effects on others. It has spawned new counsel in new places. You know, we just don't know, right? I mean, Grace Lee Boggs always liked to say this, that, you know, you are part of an inescapable net, and you moving one molecule changes the whole system. Whether or not you will ever know this. Chaos theory tells us that, right? That's that old butterfly story. We don't know what flap of the wing is going to create something different. And so all I can really do right now is to remind myself I only have a little bit of the truth, and I can apply myself still to an unwritten future. It is not entirely determined. And so then that's where the agency comes from.
Mm-hmm.
What then is my choice? And I don't see all of it. People will have different answers to that. What brings them most alive? What is the most, creative possible good thing that they could do? I've stopped telling people, when they ask me, what can I do on climate change? And I ask them, what brings you alive? And I just ask them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need, alive people and awake people. And that's more important. If you want to help people, now as a hospice worker, die peaceful lives, that's really, really meaningful work. And we will need that skill for whatever future, just as much as we need, midwives bringing in new life.
Right.
You can take that as literal or as metaphorical as you would like.
Yeah. Well, great job in creating a segue to my last question. In the focus of my work, I get to a very similar spot that you were just describing, especially because I don't hold any sort of primacy for, I don't hold the central spot for the entire conversation for climate change. I think that's a controlled narrative that's deeply crippling to the effectiveness of human beings and agency, but that's a whole nother time we can talk. I love what you were saying about find what you love, engage with it, and make that shine in your life. And there you go. I don't know how to say it any better. Another part of my work is to keep gathering what I like to call advanced practices. When people have spent a certain amount of time in that entry level, learning how to be in circle, learning how to tell their own truth, learning how to hold space for others, and those other essential entry level skills, many folks may choose to go beyond that. They feel like they've grown some capacity and they're ready to take on questions like, someone who might ask you, how can I make a difference? And I have found for myself in my own practices, and then gathering this toolbox, if you will, for others to choose from, to expand their capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors, basically. And that is really a wide-ranging set of psychospiritual practices or skills or tools. So to kind of back it off from that, advanced level and, articulating these specialized practices, if that same person came up to you, Susie, and if they were to say, what are some ways that I can really do a large amount of self-care? How might you recommend that I could do some self-care at a ever greater level to expand? How can I expand my capacity to be present in the face of larger stressors in my family, in my community? How can I literally grow myself in a good way so that I might be able to offer what I want to offer to others in my life? I want to be of service. I want to do some good stuff. And all I've ever learned is how to compete in the marketplace or how to go to school and take tests. And I don't know how to do this. Would you have any words of sharing, or I don't like the advice word much, but just, offerings from your experience that seem to help in that kind of a path?
About 200 ways to take that question. Well, so I guess it begins for me always with getting to know that person more and really trying to understand where they are and what they've done, what intrigues them, what they've tried. You know, I mean, for some people it is the kind of, I mean, it could be Tonglen practice, right? Out of Buddhism, of being with grief as a way of being with. If you're not inclined for that particular spiritual path, maybe it might just be breath work. You know, for others, it might be being far more connected with nature. I mean, if someone comes and has been mostly involved in only the practices of society and doesn't know a thing or doesn't have much of a relationship to nature, then, you know, any practice of reconnecting with the other world that we live in, not just the human Manomaya created one, but the one that we inhabit as bodily creatures. And that could be, you know, anything from physical activity, being in your own body, to and getting to know that really, and getting reacquainted with that, to being in the earth body. So it, you know, that's sort of one level. If people have not thought much beyond their very small personal sphere, helping them see themselves in cognitively in the larger systems that they're part of. You know, I can think of all kinds of sort of systemic ways to think. People who are really into organizing, you know, I like to ask them about how they think about scaling up, scaling out, scaling deep, to expand their reach and be more in sync with the scope of the challenge and how we need to organize to have bigger impact. So it kind of, it really depends a little bit on who that person is and where they feel like they're stuck, or they're not, you know, quite having enough practice. I don't know, I'm thinking of the fourfold way, you know, show up, pay attention, speak your truth, let go of outcome. I mean, there are like so many of these formulas, so many of these practices that have been distilled in these ways that, you know, that's kind of, there's a broad menu, and they all actually are, you know, speaking to the same basic things we need to do. Anyway, so there's different entry points, and it depends. I, you know, always have if you ask me, how do I keep going? It's, okay, I need to go for a hike, you know, I need to be out in the desert, I need to be on a mountaintop. So that's my place, to kind of empty, to, you know, just empty the cup so I can take in again, and have something to give. Yeah. But it's not where it's at for some people, and I don't feel like it must be one way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was an absolutely wonderful and rich response that I appreciate. You reminded me of, I just had a similar conversation with Dar Jamail a few days ago, and he, of course, is a high mountain person. So I remember him having a very similar response there. You know, just a quick question that I'm just curious if you've been connected at all with the guy named Bob Doppelt, who put out Transformational Resilience. And I'm just wondering if any of his work or concepts become useful in any of your work, or suggestions for people to kind of add to their toolkit.
I'm familiar with his work, and you know, in the grand scheme of things, it is, you know, in my mind, one of those collections of tools that will work for someone. Mm-hmm. They don't do anything for me. I'll be honest with you about it. I have a general challenge with You know, there are tools like the ones that he's amassing and putting together in his work that you can only get at a price tag. And quite frankly, I understand, by golly, I understand the need to make a living. And those sets of tools, in my mind, is what will keep us alive as a human species. I'm not in favor of putting a paywall between me and them. Every great teacher that I know, you know, that I've mentioned in just a set of tools that I've mentioned, doesn't have a paywall between their practices and the rest of who could use it. So I personally feel really strongly of making those tools as widely available as possible. But, you know, I think this is the palette maybe, or the buffet that we need to just simply recognize is out there. There are so many others that I'm not even familiar with and that other people's put forward, and God bless them for it. You know, it's wonderful that they put themselves forward. I think this is where Bob has found his way of serving the world, and who am I to say it isn't right? It just doesn't work as deeply for me as some of the other things we've talked about in this conversation.
Sure.
So, you know, I know there are many, many very qualified and very passionate people behind it and supporting it, and that's wonderful. So it, you know, I feel sort of agnostic about whether or not they're right or wrong. It's mostly about what works for you. And that's why, you know, in part I answered your question earlier to me about what do I offer, by I want to listen to people first to get a sense of who they are and then match the tool with the person asking.
Right. Thanks. Well, it's interesting that that's your take. I thought I was fairly familiar with what he's up to, but I'm going to go do some research, because I am unaware of the paywall type presence in any of his work, and so I'll be happy to look at that. All I've been really familiar with is what I gleaned from his book, and it seems like well, it's just like that. So I appreciate it. Thanks for the thoughts about that. I just want to repeat what I believe I said at the beginning, that I have really found you to be an exceptional presence in the realm of science communicators in a world. Unfortunately, there are lots of them, and I get very frustrated with many of the folks out there who call that their job. And it is your sobriety and your realness with which you communicate about delicate subjects like hope. And then there's this way that you invite I don't know what else other word to call it, but you invite a little bit of magic, a little bit of extraordinary possibility, you know, something that we just don't freaking know. And for all the negative connotations for uncertainty, you bring a kind of a magical quality that makes that uncertainty actually pretty cool. Something that you wouldn't want to leave home without.
Yeah, I call it mystery. I think that's what we live. And I say this with my science hat on, you know, we know such a small slice. And yeah, there is, you know, you can call it uncertainty, irreducible uncertainty, whatever you want it. And in my daily experience of the world, I call it mystery.
Yeah.
And
well, I'm really very, very grateful for you spending your time. I know that you've got a number of things on your plate that are filling up your time and space. And so for you to make some of that space available for this conversation, thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing out there. We need to clone you. So as soon as I find the right agency, I'll get back to you.
That would be great. I'd love to have that. Thanks so much, Dean. It's been a pleasure.
You take good care of yourself. Thank you again.
Take good care. Bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.